So, here in the second part of our context reflections, we're going to look a little bit at the ways in which the Greek culture and the Roman kind of combined and were influenced. In other words, how Greek culture influenced Roman culture, and then how that kind of played out in the Jewish community. So, Hellenism in Palestine, just one of the ways, some of the ways that it was demonstrated was this kind of Roman practice of reclining at table, which became kind of, we know this happens when Jesus goes and spends some time at dinner with different wealthy people. They will recline in the Roman fashion instead of sitting at the table. The surgical operations to reverse male circumcision was kind of a reaction against, because of the great potency of the Greek culture and its influence upon people, and the Greeks not being circumcised, many of the Jewish males began to feel, that if in order to fit in, they had to in some way reverse their own circumcision, kind of like I don't want to reduce it to a fashion statement, but it was in some ways a way to erase the experience of being, marked as a Jew. And then the Hebrew, while Hebrew was continued to be used in religious ceremonies in the synagogues, reading the scriptures, Hebrew scriptures. Aramaic was the spoken form, which is kind of it's a form of Hebrew, but it's not the same thing as Hebrew. You would need to know how to speak that. And then there was this tendency among the Romans to kind of pull together a lot of the different wisdom traditions, and that certainly there was a wisdom tradition within Israel, and to kind of respect the various cultural expressions of that. And then there was this notion of, which is really somewhat related to apocalypticism, of dualism, that the world was kind of rather simplistically divided between the good and the evil. And the good would certainly be those people who practiced things and followed their religious beliefs, certainly within Judaism. And yet they suffered regardless of the fact that, even though they were faithful to what they were doing and living their religious practices, they were also punished for not, punished or oppressed by the ruling or their own people. It would depend on who you're talking to, and versus the people who were evil and doing evil. So the people who were good and long suffering would say that in the end God would reward the good and punish the evil. And it became rather deterministic, in the sense that, okay, even though we're really, really suffering now, we will be rewarded ultimately in the end. And it created this view of history that, you kind of looked forward to the end of time when you would, be rewarded for your good practices, and that those who had, been recalcitrant would be punished, because God, is the ultimate judge of things. It's a kind of view. We're going to look more closely at apocalypticism. It's not quite as simplistic as that. They did have various views about it, but it was certainly in the air in Jesus' time as well as in the time of early Christianity, and we can see it very present in the scriptures itself, the Christian scriptures. And in the Jewish scriptures too, by the way, because it's borrowed from the experience of Judaism. So when a group of people are suffering under the oppressive structures of the oppressor, both at the political, government level, but also in the individual lives, they tend to say, "How could this be happening to me?" And the only way they can describe it is that God is good, and and my being faithful to what I'm doing will be rewarded in the end. And we can see that as part of theology in some theology today. Anyway, we could talk about that more more context later. Hellenism in the diaspora. Okay, so the diaspora is the Jewish people that live abroad. They live outside of Palestine. And they would be there because of exile experiences, where they would be forced out of Palestine, or because of mercenary things, or because they family decided to move to different areas of the world where it was more advantageous for them to live. And their families would grow up and they would want to keep alive the Jewish heritage and and we talked a little bit about this regarding the Septuagint. So these are the diaspora Jews. The word means scattering of seeds, so like the Jewish people that got scattered abroad. They left Palestine over hundreds of years for business and trade, war, whatever. They are the places where the synagogues developed. So you had the temple in Jerusalem, which was the most sacred place on the face of the earth for the Jews, where there was both sacrifice in the temple to God, and it was a house of prayer for them. But these houses of prayer, synagogues, which are these, means literally gathering together, were houses of prayer, but they were not sacrificial sites. So they would come together on the Sabbath and they would read the scriptures, and they would comment on them, and but there would be no sacrifices. For the sacrifices, you had to go to the temple. And as we know, by the the year 70 after Christ, there was the temple had been in Jerusalem was destroyed. So the synagogues become really important for carrying on the heritage of Judaism after 70, but they were very prevalent during Jesus' time. We know that in Luke 4, Jesus is in his synagogue up in Nazareth in Galilee, and he opens the scroll and he does the reading and all of that. The rabbis were also stressed in the diaspora place over the priests. Obviously, the priests were in the temple, the rabbis were in the synagogues. The Torah was always there, so the Torah was stressed over the sacrifices. You may never go to Jerusalem in your life, so if you live too far away. So the Torah became absolutely essential. The spoken word over the Hebrew or the Aramaic, the Greek was spoken over Hebrew or Aramaic, and that's why. So the lingua franca of the ancient world was Greek at this time, and so people would learn to speak Greek. Scholars would be able to do it, to speak and write in Greek, and this is why the early Christians' scriptures, even though Jesus probably spoke Aramaic, were written in Greek, because it was the common language of people in the world. And as I mentioned, it's Koine Greek in the Gospels, so it's not highfalutin Greek. It's kind of simple common Greek. And we talked about the Septuagint writings that are part of the Hebrew tradition now, very important, from about the third century before the Common Era. We can't go through all of these, but it's important to know that just as there was a lot of complexity to Judaism with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the various Zealots, the various groups there were very many varieties of the ways in which Roman rule, Roman religion, Roman philosophy worked its way into people's lives, and different perspectives on that. There were the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Cynics, the mystery religions. The importance of honoring the emperor was also there. Animism was that everything had kind of a spirit involved in it, and it was a kind of almost like a belief in the spirit world itself. And then there was this ability. Augury is the ability to be able to tell the future from, they would cut open a bird, and from the entrails of the bird, they would be able to tell whether a person was going to be successful or not, or somebody was going to win a war or not, etc. And then there were fortune tellers also. And then finally, the belief in supernaturalism. These all had, it's hard to exactly pinpoint places where it had a specific influence, but it had a kind of a general influence on the development of the early Christian community, and hence on the Gospels themselves. And we'll try to point them out at times when those things become present. Perhaps maybe not as explicitly as, it was in the air all around, and so it had an impact on them in that way. And then the other important group was this group called the Gnostics. The word comes from gnosis, the Greek word which means knowledge, that there's this special knowledge that only the spiritually initiated can have, that will save them. And the basic belief or worldview of the Gnostic was predominantly that anything material was deemed evil. That only the spirit that it was good, and that part of human life was to be removed, to remove oneself. Sorry for all that background noise, if you can hear that. Um, Material was evil. In other words, the body, the flesh, was evil, and then the only thing that was good was the spirit, and the belief that somehow our souls, our spirits, are incarcerated in the material body when we are born, and it's part of our lives to set ourselves free from that. Um, so the body is really deemed by them to be evil, to be a tomb in which people live, and again, it's kind of a simplistic way to do it. We don't know how influential it was on early Christianity, but you can certainly see the residue of it in Christianity. And it poses a tremendous challenge to Christianity, even though they by the second to the fourth century, it was a full-blown phenomenon. So some scholars think it wasn't as active early on. But recently, they've dug up the Nag Hammadi library, which is this group of Gnostic texts that have a lot of reflection on early Christian practice. They were Gnostic Christians in the later first century and second and third and fourth centuries. So the challenge is this, that the Gospels are pretty clear about the incarnation, that the Word in John's Gospel says at the very beginning, chapter 1, the Word, or the Logos, became flesh and dwells among us. In other words, that Jesus becomes the embodiment of God's presence in the flesh. And so for a Christian, it becomes a real conundrum to deal with the fact that here's a group of people saying that, a group of Christians saying that the flesh is evil, and it can't be evil if God created it, first of all, and secondly, if Jesus chooses to become flesh. So it becomes a theological kind of conundrum for the early Christians. But you can also see the residue of it still in people's spirituality even today, because it's also present in the scriptures themselves. Anyway, so we'll have opportunity to look at some of that when we just a kind of summary things. Okay, so keep in mind it's an oral culture. That's, in other words, people tell things first. They tell stories, and that it's a rather sophisticated thing to actually have the skills to be able to write things down, like a scribe does. They have to be educated in how to write. Most people could not read or write. They would certainly make their mark, but they couldn't read or write. The majority of the people in the ancient world, and so keep that in mind. The early Christians first told stories about Jesus, and they were passed around. And believe me, it was among it certainly were there some wealthy people who were part of early Christianity, but it was also very attractive to the ordinary people who didn't have, especially the poor and the outcasts in the culture. And it's an honor-shame society. Honor and shame means that you don't bring shame upon anyone in your family or culture, particularly your family, but also in anybody who's your superior in any way, shape, or form. So younger brother doesn't bring shame to the older brother, and things like that. This is an important piece, and we'll see how this works out. Like, for example, in the story of the prodigal son, when the young son goes and asks the father for his inheritance, and the father gives it to him and doesn't rebuke or anything, because that story is about the generosity of God the Father, really, in this particular example. But he really brought shame upon his father by going to him and saying, basically, give me my share while his father's still alive. In some ways, wishing him dead because he could have these resources, and then of course squandering it brings more shame. But we see how God responds to that in this parable. It's a multicultural society. I already mentioned this. A very diverse Judaism, a very diverse Hellenism, and a very diverse Roman world. Christianity was rooted in Hellenistic Judaism, really Greco-Roman Judaism, in a world controlled by the Roman Empire. Early Christianity was not monolithic. Everybody was not the same, is what I'm saying. Okay? There were people who were kind of Jewish and kind of Christian. There were people who were very Jewish and a little Christian. There were people who were very Greek and Christian, and there were very people who were inimical to being Greek and Christian, and people who, so it was this very complex network, much like our world today. In that sense, the people are free to, I shouldn't say free, because I don't think people were as free as we are, but certainly would put together things in their lives in a way to make sense out of it for themselves, which is, good. We don't have, the other thing to realize is we don't have Jesus' exact words. In Catholic tradition, it's one of the actually most recent teachings of the Pontifical Biblical Commission in Rome. They said the understanding of how the Gospels developed rests upon, first of all, what Jesus said and did during his life, then what the apostles and the disciples said Jesus said and did during their lives, and then what the early Christian communities wrote about Jesus. So you've got the heart of things is the teaching and the life of Jesus, and then after he dies and is raised, they go forth and they talk about this, and it's orally spread around in various different ways, stories that were important, adapting them to the needs of the community, and then what early Christian communities wrote when they sat down and gathered them together. So it's kind of this threefold kind of process. Remember, it's a patriarchal society, the male at the top, and kinship, blood-based. You stay with your family and you build this cohesive community. Older members of the family live together with younger members. We're not a kinship-based society, basically, here in the United States. We basically don't live in these kinds of ways. But some of the communities of the sisters that are in our class would also be more kinship-oriented but our world is becoming less and less kinship-based. Also, Israel was occupied by the Romans during this particular period of time. We mentioned this before. And then the last thing to just mention is just this the difference between, in the ancient world, people usually divided the world between themselves and everybody else. So we have the Jews, and everybody else is called Gentiles, the Goy, the other people, literally. And then the Greeks would call the other people the barbarians. So most of the times they identified themselves and then how they viewed the other group. The economic stratification and class situation in the ancient world was usually divided between those who worked with their hands, which was who did not work with their hands, and that's the upper class, and those who did work with their hands. There was no middle class, so don't be thinking that somebody in the lower class could move up to the upper class. No, that didn't happen. In the upper class, it was usually about 5% of the population that controlled all of the resources in the society, including all the resources that the lower classes were requiring. Most of the people in the lower classes were peasants. There were some artisans too, that second grouping there. And then at the very bottom of society were these degraded and expendables, these people that were just very, very poor. The peasants lived a subsistence level, meaning they were always this close to losing everything, They often lived on a little plot of land, on a larger estate, with their families, and if there was a famine or whatever, they would be reduced to nothing and starvation. So first of all, Jesus comes from the artisan class. It seems that Joseph is described as a tekton. He's from the lower class. Joseph is a tekton, which is a kind of a woodworker or someone who kind of creates things with their hands. And he also ministers, obviously, to and comes to reach out to those who are in the poorer, degradable and expendable classes. And then finally, the last thing is that religion itself is conceived as a kind of part of the whole nexus of things in the culture. It's not like we have, segregated out our religious, our political, our social, our academic. We kind of separate things out. In the ancient world, there was no such thing. It was all kind of put together. It wasn't clear. Oh, this I'm this or I'm that. It was all put together into a reality that embodied the social institutions of the culture itself. So politics is important in the ancient world as it is in ours, of course, but more in the sense of so politics means in Greek the shape of the city, um, and we some people say Jesus was not political, but not political in our understanding of the term, of having an agenda and a political office. But as far as being interested in the shape of his city, you bet he was interested in the shape of his city. He was trying to transform his culture and his world and our world into God's reign and the principles that guided that. So we'll have to nuance that when we talk more explicitly about it. But anyway, for now, just keep that in mind that in the ancient world, this was all